Okay, how can Christianity be true when, for example, Hindus were much more intellectually advanced, inventing algebra, many principles of mathematics, and being first to calculate the number p? Aryabhata, or how you say, invented zero, etc. The most advanced ideas about the cosmos and mathematics originated from India. How do you explain this?
Yeah, many cultures developed many different things. China was had a lot more technology than the Roman world did 2,000 years ago. There was a lot of advances made in the Islamic world and in the Indian world. There's no doubt about that. The question you need to ask yourself, though, is why did modern science arise in Europe, and why did Europe eventually outpace the rest of the world? A lot of what these other cultures were doing were not what they considered to be science. We could call it proto science, perhaps. It was more a philosophy. They were coming up with different concepts to sort of explain different models they had of the world. These were more about philosophical exercises than actual rigorous science because they didn't have a concept of science like modern Westerners do. They looked at the world as various forces of chaos at work, fighting with order, but in the Christian West, they had the belief there was a supreme God who controlled everything. There were not different forces fighting with one another. He set certain laws in motion. We could discover those laws and how the world worked. Europeans were very interested in knowledge and they gathered as much as they could. They collected the best of the best, brought it to Europe, and then made advances on that. And in their specific Christian worldview, they were able to then take it far further than the Indians or the Chinese or the Islamic world could because they had a far different system that allowed them to advance and go much further. So, yeah, there were different concepts being developed around the world, but no one really took them and put them into a concept that we call science, ways to actually study the world. You look at the ancient Greeks, they weren't really studying the world that much. I mean, Aristotle did some observations for sure, but what they were trying to do is come up with the best model to explain reality. They weren't doing a lot of experimentation to test results. A lot of people didn't even think physics and mathematics could work together. These were two separate domains. Same with astronomy and cosmology. These don't get merged until much later in the West. So, like, astronomy was originally more mathematical, and cosmology was more about observing of the stars. And then later they get sort of merged into one when people realize that they're working together and how they work together. But these were different domains. These were different philosophies at a time. And you needed a Christian West, a Christian worldview, as scholars like Edward Grant in his book, The Foundation of Modern Science, notes, to actually make what became modern science. So, yeah, various cultures made advances. Some were even made in Europe. But what the Christian West did is it took as much knowledge as they could, build on it, and in the worldview of the Christian West, they were able to advance it into modern science. The Islamic world could not. In the Islamic world, scientific learning was only useful insofar as it benefited Islam. You can use trigonometry if it can help you figure out how to pray to face Mecca, but beyond that, don't use it for anything else. That's kind of what was sort of going on in that world. Uh, Christian West allowed science to develop it into its own institution, just not serving religious purposes or mythological purposes, and it became what it is today. So it took the ideology of the Christian West to get us to modern science, even though other cultures made advances.
Thank you, but don't we expect, if Christianity is true, to be the best and everyone else to be dumb or foolish? That's what some people think if this is the true religion.
Yeah, no, that doesn't follow at all because we see in the Bible God is using many people. He uses Cyrus the Great to do his will, for example, to free the Jews. So he uses all sorts of people outside. In fact, one of the interesting things is the first person ever raised from the dead in the Bible is a Gentile. It's Elijah called to go to the region of Sidon, and he raises the widow's child there. So he's never said this idea that you have to be like a follower of him to receive blessings or knowledge or anything like this. This was also not what the early church taught. Again, Augustine taught we should seize knowledge wherever we can find it from the pagans. And of course, we all believe that God created everybody. Everybody is in the image of God. Most people have just gone astray, and Christianity tries to call them back. But they still have uh, cognitive faculties that God gave them that should work and can help them discover things. So we don't say everyone should be dumb other than us. Christianity, we just say, is the most fulfilling, and best way to live as a human. It's not going. That doesn't mean that you can't find good in other places.
Thank you. Now, Judeo-Christian faith emerged relatively recently. How is it possible that this is the true religion when it appeared only in the last, let's say, 3 or 4 thousand years, or even 2,000 years if you want to start with Jesus? Shouldn't it have been there from the very beginning? For example, what would the true religion have been before Abraham?
Yeah, well, we don't say that it just started with Abraham. Abraham was sort of restoring what was lost. It really goes back to Adam and Eve, for example. Genesis 1 to 11 recounts the downfall of humanity and them moving further away from God. And then starting with Genesis, the end of Genesis 11, it's God starting to draw humanity back to him very slowly. So, if you check out a video I did called The Case for Ancient Monotheism, I point out that in a lot of very primitive hunter-gatherer societies, we find evidence of very monotheistic type worship, not polytheistic or animistic, but very monotheistic worship with a similar view of God of what we find in Judeo Christian thought. So, I mean, various ancient cultures seem to have been perfectly fine believing in a monotheistic creator. And so it's very likely that there could have been various ways God revealed himself to humans in the past. And now Christianity is just the final way that God is calling everyone back to him.
All right, and this is a longer one. Nicomachean Ethics, Aristotle, Plato's Apology. These are much stronger concepts than Christian ethics. The Greeks were much wiser. How can Christianity be true? If the true God revealed himself in the person of Jesus, wouldn't he have provided philosophical and ethical teachings that would surpass those of the Greeks? In reality, Christianity is not even close to what Greek philosophers were doing 500 years earlier. What's your response?
Well, I'm glad Christianity is not close to what the Greek philosophers were doing because a lot of them were engaging in pederasty, where they were basically going after boys for sexual purposes. The idea that Greeks had a more superior ethics is absurd. Of course, Christian ethics is far superior than what the Greeks were doing. First of all, they believed that slavery was natural. Aristotle taught this. Out of the Christian West, we see the first abolitionist movements for a reason. Uh, the ancient Greeks and Romans didn't believe in equality. They believed in the hierarchy and with themselves, of course, on top. Christianity comes along and teaches all are equal, all are image to God, all have inherent value and equal rights. Oh, and by the way, the only sex you're allowed is sex within marriage. Uh, so that was game changer, and of course, Christians had to combat a lot of the horrible things being done to children in the ancient world. John Martins notes that the Christians came up with a whole new word to explain what they were doing, which they didn't want to use the typical term, which is like child lover, because it was neutral, and they wanted to use another term. So they came up with a term that meant child corruption, because they wanted to really show that what they were doing to children was evil and harmful. The idea that they had a superior ethics is absurd. It just isn't really based in reality when you study what they were doing. You know, one of the ways we can identify an ancient Roman brothel is from the high amount of infant graves, because a lot of the women there, sorry, girls, because most of them were pretty young, were slaves. They didn't have a right to their own body or their own children. So they'd have a child from working there, and then they would kill the child, and so that the girl could get back to work quicker. And so when we find a high amount of infant graves, we expect a brothel was nearby because that's what they were doing to keep the girls working in the brothel. Christianity comes along and outlaws that stuff, invents orphanages, turns monasteries into orphanages to start caring for children. So most children that were abandoned by their parents in the ancient Roman world ended up in brothels or slaves. Meanwhile, when Christians found them, they ended up in orphanages. I mean, there's just no comparison here into what Christianity did. It created human rights. It was crucial for ending slavery, for giving far better lives to children throughout the ancient world. I mean, this isn't controversial. Just read books by like O.M. Baki, how when Christian became or when children became people. Paul Among the People by Sarah Rudin, for example. The Rise and Fall of Childhood by Somerville as well. There's just no contest here. The Christian ethics was far better for humanity, and that's ultimately one of the main reasons that it won.